Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. Hello, Stu. How are you?
Hi Lorraine, I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Well, Stu, the reason that I thought it would be a really good idea for us to have a Conveyancing Matters chat is because a really important point that actually you've mentioned quite a lot over the last few months has really, unfortunately, sort of come to pass. And you know, I don't think we can pass up the chance to talk about it. So, in the 30th of November 2020 edition of the Mortgage Finance Gazette, of all things, which actually is for mortgage brokers, obviously, they have come up with, a really terrible story, but nonetheless one that you've been talking about for a long, long time. Couple lose life savings as buyer's lender withdraws post-contract. And I know this is something that's sort of, an issue of big concern to you, Stu. So let me just mention, for the benefit of probably most people that haven't read this article yet, broadly speaking, what's reported as having happened is, as I say, this couple had exchanged contracts. They were in a chain, a situation that all conveyancers will recognise. And of course, what has happened is exchange of contracts has taken place, but on their buyers, on their sale, their buyer's mortgage offer was withdrawn by Santander. So their mortgage offer was fine, but they'd already exchanged. Their buyer's mortgage offer was withdrawn. They were kind of moving up. So of course, their buyer, of course, forfeited their deposit, but that still left these clients, these individuals, £33,000 down, because they were owed a further 33k on their related. And the chain collapsed as a result, which is sort of terrible. I mean, and these poor couple are quoted as saying, well, that's our 7 years savings. We've got no money. We've got an 8-month-old baby. And of course, Stu, we'll have a look at a few more of the facts in a minute, but this is the very, very thing that you talk about almost week in, week out, isn't it, mate?
Yeah, it's a massive concern of mine. I think it probably stems from one of the very first completions I did when I was sort of 18, so sort of about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Maybe less, maybe 2 years ago.
Like about five, 6 years ago, when I was 18, all excited, one of my very first completions. And in between the exchange and completion, I had a mortgage offer pulled on a client of mine. And that did mean that they were unable to complete. So I was aware of this issue from for a long time.
From the get-go, isn't it? I think the funny thing is about it, well, not funny, I mean, the odd thing is about these things too, that I think as practitioners, sometimes, you have to have experienced it. And it's often things quite early in your career, actually. If you've experienced it and you know the awfulness of it, it's something that never leaves you. And lots of, dare I say, and I really don't want to sound patronising, but I think as somebody who's like officially old this week, a lot of perhaps our younger colleagues watching this won't necessarily have experienced, the withdrawal of an offer between exchange and completion, because we always just expect, once matters have exchanged, for them to go ahead. And of course, one of the things we were talking about before we press record is, again, the COVID situation in general means that the prospect of mortgage offers being withdrawn is that much greater, because unfortunately of job insecurity, furlough still carrying on. Lenders have said they're now going to take furlough into account when looking at people's ability to, affordability. And of course, the point you make about change of circumstances, Stu.
That's right. So let's get it straight. When we exchange contracts, you are exchanging between the buyer and the seller. It's a contractual obligation between a buyer and a seller only. The mortgage party are not party to that contract. So the mortgage company aren't bound to give you the money on any certain day. The conditions within the mortgage offer, that contractual arrangement between a buyer and their mortgage company, only becomes live when, as a lawyer, you use that money and you complete on that purchase. So that contract takes effect on the day of completion, not when you've exchanged contracts. So as we've just sort of discussed before with the COVID situation, etc., somebody's circumstances are more likely to change at the moment than ever before. When you apply for that mortgage offer, the bank take into account your circumstances at that time.
Yeah.
Your circumstances then later change, so does, potentially the mortgage, or your ability to borrow that level of money from the mortgage company, and that's the danger.
And well, actually, and one of the things I've sort of pointed out on courses and things before, and certainly in recent months, Stu, is that obligation to disclose a material change in circumstances to a lender once you've got an offer. It's an obligation, of course, that's on the borrower, but of course it's also on the conveyancer. So
Yep.
if the conveyancer finds out that their buyer client's circumstances have changed, the conveyancer is obliged to disclose that to the lender.
Yep.
Or of course, because of our duty of confidentiality, if the buyer says, I don't want you to disclose that to the lender, then all we can do is withdraw and send the mortgage offer back. But of course, one of the things I've thought about and suggested to conveyancers, because again, this is just such a recurring theme with us, if and when a load of transactions, end up, next year, and the lenders are looking around for someone to blame if they make a loss, there is absolutely no doubt they're going to come after the conveyancers. Some lenders have departments whose only raison d'etre is to look at files and come after conveyancers. But of course, I was wondering whether as conveyancers, we would want to be saying to our clients, probably just before exchange, have your circumstances changed? Is there anything about your circumstances, whether actual or known? Are you a part of a redundancy consultation? Is your company one of the unfortunate, tragic many that aren't going to make it through this COVID situation? Should we be saying to our buyers, have your circumstances changed, and therefore considering telling the lenders? Would you think about doing that?
Without doubt. I think you need to expressly sort of commit to this subject on 3 separate occasions. First of all, terms and conditions. We will inform our clients within the terms and conditions of exactly what we're talking about now, and the fact that the bank will become effectively a client of ours. We're going to act on behalf of the bank as well as you, and there's always probably a separate subject for another day. Could be sort of separate representation. Is there almost an underlying conflict when you act on behalf of the bank and the client? Potentially. But, for us, we always make this crystal clear in our terms and conditions. I think most law firms, if not all law firms, will now have a mortgage report that will go to the client when the offer arrives. So obviously, it needs to be detailed in there. And I think anybody that's not read their own mortgage reports for a while, give it a once over, and you'd be surprised sometimes how much detail's in there. And, it's not just designed to report to the client, but also to cover our backs. And quite rightly, as you've just said, just before you exchange contracts, it's a red flag, isn't it? So we need to advise the clients, what they're about to enter into when they commit to the contract and the potential risk. And of course, this now in this climate is a risk.
Yeah, and I think also, you're right, Stu, albeit I think, I sometimes think the converse. You've said firms would be surprised at what's in their report. I think there's probably plenty of people looking at this today who, will rush back to their report and realise this stuff isn't in there. But I do wonder, and again, something that concerns me, and it's kind of harks back to sort of the leasehold stuff, when the SRA did a review on particularly first-time buyers' attitude to leases, and loads of first-time buyers said, I didn't know anything about it, didn't know what a lease was. Well, I can guarantee the vast majority of those people will have got a report from their conveyancer, but they either won't have read it or won't have understood it. And I think the same about a mortgage report, because there's going to be a whole lot of people out there who say, well, I didn't know my conveyancer said my mortgage offer could be withdrawn. So I wonder, again, even if this stuff is in your mortgage report, given that heightened possibility of that mortgage offer being withdrawn in our current climate, whether firms should be actually, as you say, repeating it, but bringing that point sort of almost to the top of the pile. Don't put it on page 3 of your report, put it at the top in big letters. And maybe, and I know a lot of firms will do this now, Stu, and it's all admin. It's a ball's ache, but whether you actually, because it's so important, get your client to sign and return or acknowledge that they've had it, have a click button for them to sort of say they've read it. I know if you've got, a fantastic case management system on your app, there's a sort of read receipt thing if you've got that sort of thing, and that's fantastic if you have. But some evidence that the firm has got that the advice has been given, it's been, I suggest, prominently given, and that the client has read it, because we will be in the firing line again. And also that evidence on the file thing, I do seriously think that firms, as we've said, Stu, if firms are saying to their buyers just before exchange, you know, are you still employed? Are you aware of redundancy? Is there anything about your circumstances that might change? I think we need that recorded on our file so that
Without doubt.
if the lender comes knocking, we've got the evidence again that we asked.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
I think also, you know, it's telling the client that, you know, if your circumstances change, you know, you also need to report that to the bank. And it doesn't have to actually be, you know, I know we're sort of going slightly off on a tangent here, but it doesn't have to be sort of COVID specific either.
no.
Again, when I sort of first started, one of my first completions were where a couple's mortgage offer was pulled. It was because they'd committed to buying tons of furniture on sort of buy now, pay later deals, lots of stuff on the credit cards. Of course, the credit rating of the client then changed. That was a material change deemed by the lender, so the lender pulled the mortgage offer.
Yeah, and that was probably in a time when the lenders weren't nearly as cautious as they are now.
Not nearly as anywhere near, not even probably 1/10.
Yeah.
So it does, you know, there is that massive risk out there, and I suppose, you know, clients can get overly excited, can't they? You've just exchanged contracts. You're going to move in a couple of weeks. Let's go and buy a load of furniture. But you've got to be very, very careful.
Also, well, what I find really interesting about this article, and forgive me while I cast through it, but and I absolutely mean no disrespect to the person that's written this article. It's written from the perspective of mortgage brokers, but I think it's interesting because it demonstrates quite a disconnect between you know, the brokers, the clients, and the conveyancers, really. Because firstly, and I'll pick out a few comments for you, Stu, because firstly, they've described this issue of the mortgage offer being pulled as an alarming new pitfall in the house buying process. They also have said, where is blah, blah, blah. Well, interestingly, apparently these people who lost their money, whose buyers had their mortgage offer pulled by Santander, well, they tried to contact Santander. Well, that to me, just no disrespect to anybody for trying, and I probably would try, but it indicates a complete misunderstanding, because why are Santander going to discuss their mortgage offer with you know, with somebody else? I mean, the fact is they're not. But what I find really interesting is that they say here, and I'm quoting, "It has been widely assumed by mortgage brokers and home buyers alike that a mortgage deal in place at exchange cannot be withdrawn before completion. It appears in practice that this is not the case." Exactly. That's not the case.
It's never been the case either. It's never ever been that the mortgage company's party to that contract. Never ever. So it is a big worry, you know. I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody that's written the article, but, you know, this is sort of plain obvious stuff. And, you know, again, as lawyers, we're the ones there to break the bad news, to point out, you know, the pitfalls of what you're doing and so on and so forth. And there does seem to be sort of this theory that, you know, you've got the mortgage offer, everything's okay, but it's certainly not at that stage.
No, and well, then go on to say, it's a scales falling from the eyes thing. This means that for a period of between 1 and 2 weeks, all buyers in the chain are entirely at the mercy of every lender involved.
Correct.
Any one of whom might theoretically pull out. Yes. That's exactly the point.
And this is half the stuff that we bang on about, and this is what's sometimes frustrating when, you know, we have this obligation as lawyers to the bank to report things and so on and so forth. We get it in the neck. We're being told that we're sometimes, you know, delaying a transaction. We're not. You know, we're reporting the circumstances so that when we do exchange, we've given the bank all the information that they might require. You know, if we didn't report something and that was to come up after exchange, the bank will pull that mortgage offer. That's why we report things like gifted deposits. You know, like, for example, if there's an allowance or a difference on the, you know, difference between the purchase price and the contract price, we report these things all before we exchange contracts for this very reason, to stop the bank withdrawing. And at least if there was a problem, it's before exchange of contracts and before the client's committed.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, a lot of people forget that we have this duty to report. It's not because we want to make everybody's chain difficult, but I'm just really interested in this.
The bank's our client. That's what people forget. You know, we are instructed by the bank to act on their behalf.
Yeah.
So
this is, I'm just surprised, you know, the tone of this article, because they are sort of, it's genuine sort of bafflement. But what I also think is quite important for conveyancers out there to realise is that they quote, research earlier this year by Butterfield Mortgages suggested that as many as 3 in 10 buyers whose chains had collapsed had ended up losing their deposits as mortgage offers were withdrawn post-contract. And that's a very you know, sobering statistic. And I think, you know, again, just to remind conveyancers that, you know, they've got to be bringing this risk to the attention of their buyers before exchange. And of course, well, the point we made when we were chatting, Stu, the point you made about, but the risk has always been there, you know.
The risk has always been. I'll tell you another massive area of risk for other lawyers out there as well, and that's new build, where you may be exchanging contracts on notice with a completion date which could be, you know, 6 months away, even a year away, and the importance of long stop dates to try and you know, finalise some kind of time frame. Those sort of things on new build are really important, because obviously a client's circumstances within 6 months or a year even, where they've already exchanged, you know, you could almost say, you know, will change, are likely to change. So a real flashing red light would be new build transactions, and making sure that the clients particularly know. We actually have that documented as a separate report on new builds.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's, you know, probably a topic for another Conveyancing Matters too, because there are, well, frankly, so many risks that you almost wonder why anybody takes them. But I do think what's interesting is, and I think I can safely say this isn't going to happen, because there's a suggestion that these poor buyers, you know, their only hope currently is that the government may eventually offer compensation for people in this predicament. No, the government is not going to be stepping in and, you know, offering compensation for people whose contracts fail to proceed for whatever reason. There might be, you know, the cladding crisis, probably every reason to do something, but the government is not going to step into essentially a private contract.
Of course not. And as you've said, this has been, you know, this has always been the case. This is not something new. This is unfortunately only being highlighted because of somebody's recent loss. This has been something that every buyer goes through, and in the office of every law firm every day, there are thousands of buyers that exchange contracts and enter into this kind of arrangement where there is this kind of risk. And as you said quite rightly, in the article points out, it might not be you as the buyer. You could be in a chain, and you could have 5, 6 buyers in a chain, and of course each one then carries that risk and will affect the chain accordingly.
Yeah, and I also think what's interesting, of course, is that what these buyers, of course, would have the right to do is obviously to claim their loss from their buyers.
Yep.
But there's that age-old litigators sort of adage, isn't there? You know, if people ain't got the money, they ain't worth suing. So there is.
Yeah, you can't get blood out of a stone, Lorraine, can you?
No, absolutely not. I mean, so there, you know, the contractual and legal and sort of litigation framework is there to enable these buyers to try to recover that lost deposit on their related. But of course, as you know, if their buyers haven't got the money, then they haven't got the money.
So difficult. How far do you go with this? Because if you've got a chain of say 5, 6 of you, you know, you're reliant on the money situation of that first time buyer. They've saved enough money to get their deposit. That the moment they haven't got to pay their stamp duty, if for whatever reason, you know, their mortgage failed, would they be able to substantiate the claim of a chain with that many people in? I suggest not.
No.
And of course, you may well find that you've got a contractual obligation with somebody further up where, you know, they're contracting on the sale and they're contracting on the purchase. So they have their liability, but they may not be able to reclaim that liability, for want of a word, from below. That's the difficulty, isn't it?
It absolutely is. But as you quite rightly said, and probably the point, because we only thought this would take us 10 minutes to talk about this, but, you know, maybe that's the point to conclude here, because, you know, the risk is there, but crucially, as you quite rightly said, Stu, the risk has always been there. I absolutely applaud the fact that you know, publications highlight these risks, and I think it's a really useful reminder, particularly now. But actually, you know, the reality is that it's a risk that's there for everybody in a conveyancing chain every day of the week.
Yeah. Definitely. No, 100%.
Oh, well, I'm really pleased we've had the chance to talk about this, Stu, not least, as I say, because it's been something you've mentioned on more than one occasion. And I really, really hope that perhaps conveyancers are inspired, even in the midst of a pandemic, to go and look at their reports and make sure this stuff is in there, but also think about how do I make that advice more prominent, because I do think that's really important.
I think that's definitely the thing to take from this video today is, not just checking that, this information is contained within your reports, but at the moment, due to the current sort of climate, is make this more prevalent or a separate report, and also just before we exchange contracts, so you've got the client's ultimate attention, so they're listening, to what you're saying because of this enhanced risk.
Excellent. Okay, Stu. Well, thanks for that, lovely. I will no doubt see you very soon.
No worries. Take care. Thanks a lot. No worries. Take care. Bye.